Hey, Michelle again. So back for our fourth video about the Toltec Mounds, now Plum Bayou Mounds book and what we know about what's going on at the site down there. I read through chapter 3 and it's really just kind of giving us the idea of what they had planned to try to do with the site. And my very favorite takeaway, which kind of encompasses all of life really, is that they had planned 3 phases for the archaeological work at what is now Plum Bayou Mounds. And so phase 1 was planned for 1977 through 1979, and they were going to do some initial exploration of the site, do some shovel testing, do some random test pitting and things like that. And then phase 1 extended from 1977 to 1985. And so that was my biggest takeaway from chapter 3 was nothing goes to plan. Everything takes longer than you think it's going to take. So like I said, chapter 3 really was more a just kind of summary of what they hope to do through time at Plum Bayou Mounds. And they've done a lot of it. It just, as I said, took a lot longer than they initially had hoped it might. All right, so we are going to mainly focus today on chapter 4, Mound S, and the excavation and chronology of Mound S. The subsequent chapters go into the artifact analysis, and we'll talk about those in a future video. Mound S, there wasn't a lot of data about it in any of the previous work or maps or things. It's very low. When they went out and actually did some measurements on the surface in 1979, they found that it's actually only a 0.32 meter rise kind of on the surface. So it was plowed over quite a bit and also not really noticed as a mound because that's about a foot maybe. So you're not going to see that rise really when you're standing out there. So it was definitely plowed. A lot of times it was kind of around. There were buildings around the area, not on the mound itself, but there were other buildings around, and so it was just never noticed or mapped in earlier mapping and research times. And there was also grazing going on at that section of the site. Different people, like we talked about last time, own different parts of the site. This part was at some points a grazing area as well. So in 1979, this was looked at as part of the random sampled area of the phase 1. And so they kind of gridded out the whole site and then randomly chose spots to do some work in. And this was one of the places that were randomly chosen. And so they did auger testing, which is just kind of a big soil core essentially. It winds down, you pull it out so you can see what's underground. So 79 is really before we're doing much remote sensing and archaeogeophysics. Now that's what we do first, and we don't have to dig a hole. We can just look at what's underground via other methods. But they did do a little bit of that here, like a little bit later, but it was very new, and it wasn't something that people were doing every time and had like internal staff to be able to do. So they did auger testing and they showed that there was deepening midden as they went through this area. So they had a suspicion that something was going on there, still not necessarily that it was a mound, but they put in a 1 meter by 2 meter unit. And that showed that there were artifacts coming out as well, and that it looked like it was probably mound fill and that there were multiple layers. And I can show on the screen some of the layers that they map in this chapter 4. And so in 1980, so a couple of years later, they bring in someone from Nebraska to do proton magnetometer survey. So this is an early remote sensing technique. We still use magnetometers now, so looking at magnetic differences in the soils. And they did that and they showed that there were 3 anomaly areas to kind of look at. And so in 1980, later in 1980, they put in a trench through the area, which turns out that it was a mound, so they put a trench through this mound. And it showed that there were multiple layers, again, like we just saw, and you could see the basket loading of the soils. So the people at Plum Bayou would have filled up baskets with soil, brought it over to build the mound and dumped it out, and you could see those individual basket loads. There's not a photo, at least in this chapter, of that you can see, but I presume there are photos somewhere. But they see that there are these 4 different layers of soil, and that the base of the mound, where the mound started to be piled up for soil, seems to be about 0.8 meters below the current ground surface. So they were filling in potentially maybe a lower spot and then building a mound over the top of it. And so 0.8 meters, about 2.5-ish feet. So in 1988, 89, and 90, we had the Arkansas Archeological Survey and Society training program out at the site and at Mound S, and they excavated over those 3 summers 308 square meters of area around the mound. So they got a really good look at on the mound, around the mound, in different directions to see different things. And I'll show you a map here where the excavation units are, so you can kind of see that. And actually, I found this really interesting. They had 150 volunteers out the first year, and then they had like 120, I think, the second year, and then 160 the third year. So they got a lot done, they got a lot excavated, and then they had to do lab work for years subsequent to that to get all of the artifacts and things processed that came out of the ground. So it appears from looking at the soils, although I think this is a little bit questionable, that the mound was probably built kind of in one go, in one year, with the basket loads of soil being brought in, piled up. But a lot of the top of the surface was plowed away over time. So they propose in here that the mound was probably about 40 centimeters tall, which isn't super tall, right? And then they say that you don't see a lot of weathering of the soil like between, but because we're missing a lot of the top because of plowing, I feel like we should take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. That layer that we still have, that intact mound layer, was built probably in one year, but whether there were other layers on top of it maybe, we just can't know that. So what we know is that what's here was probably done in one go. And so interestingly, under the surface, they found 81 features. There were a number of different sorts of features that they found. There were a lot of pit features, there were some post holes, there were a bunch of charcoal concentrations that were pretty shallow but had a good amount of charcoal in them. They had ash lenses, which different from the charcoal concentrations, I guess. There was one intruding Mississippian burial, and then there was a historic pit that was also intruding on the Plum Bayou Mound. So all of those together, they got a lot of good samples to be able to do some radiocarbon dating. They've got 7 radiocarbon dates funded and run, and those dates ranged from the 600s CE to about 1295. And they explained that in that there were some Mississippian components kind of intruding the burial, but then there were some other shell-tempered sherds and stuff showing up kind of around. So we know that people were using the site past the late terminal woodland period when a lot of this was happening. But we see that it started to be used, or our earliest dates that we're seeing in Mound S are in the 600s, so that's kind of what they were expecting to see being a Plum Bayou culture type site. All right, so next time we will talk about the artifacts. We'll get into those chapters, and I will get some pictures of those up on the screen for that video as well, so that you can kind of get an idea, especially if you're coming to the training program this summer, and of what sorts of things you should expect to be seeing when you're out there excavating. So thanks for joining me again this week, talking about Mound S. Again, I'm gonna start trying to do these more often than every other week so we can get through all of our chapters before the training program. But again, thanks for joining me, and I will see you again soon. Bye.